Hi there, John Fluevog. We're back reading Roald Dahl's book. It's called The Twits, and we're on a section called the Wormy Spaghetti. You guys, this is Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit. These two are incredible, amazing. All right. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit. It was a bad trick, by the way. Mrs. Twig sneaked into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones, and she put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. What do you think she's up to? I don't know. We're going to find out. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti. I got a feeling. Okay, at 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms with the spaghetti. Yeah. But not only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around it with his fork. "Oh, it's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoving them into his mouth. Soon there's tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, taking a mouthful. "Well, it's too squishy." "Ooh, I'm finding it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "Ooh, I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinct bitter flavor. Buy the other kind next time," he said. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten a whole plateful, and then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of his tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had that bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with a horrible laughter. Okay, I got to show you the picture. There it is. Oh my gosh. Out of control. So the next one's called the funny walking stick. To pay, this is like payback. It just goes on and on, all right? Well, I got to say they're fairly inventive. So let's see what goes on here. The funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a very clever, nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to the woodshed. There he stuck a funny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. What's he up to here? This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck another bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added a tiny bit of thickness to the wood at the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Ooh. Now, when something's growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice that it's happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice from 1 week to the next. Well, that's if you're a kid, of course, and then there's people like me that are shrinking. That's not in the book, I just added that. Okay, it was the same time when Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Well, why so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "Oh, I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." There's something wrong, all right, Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. Oh, what can have happened? Mrs. Twit said, staring at her walking stick. It suddenly seems to have grown longer. Don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow. Well, then what on earth has happened? Cried Mrs. Twit. It's not the stick. It's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. Oh, it's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, cried Mrs. Twit. You're shrinking, woman, said Mr. Twit. Oh, it's not possible. Why, it jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Oh, he is bad. Well, the two of them are bad, of course. So the next one is titled Mrs. Twit has a shrinks, sorry. As soon as Mrs. Twink sat down, Mr. Twiggs pointed out to her and shouted, There you are. You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much that your feet aren't even touching the ground. Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. You see, he had just been as clever with the chairs as a walking stick. Every night when he went downstairs, he stuck a little bit extra onto the stick. He had done to the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. My, oh my, he's bad. Just look at you sitting in your same old chair, he cried. You shrunk so much that your feet are dangling in the air. Mrs. Twit went white with fear. You've got the shrinks, cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen. Mrs. Twit became so frightened that she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit still remembered the worms in his spaghetti and didn't feel sorry for her at all. I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks, he said. Well, what? Gasped Mrs. Twit. What happens? Your head shrinks into your neck. And your neck shrinks into your body. And your body shrinks into your legs. And your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left of you except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes. Oh, I can't bear it, cried Mrs. Twit. It's a terrible disease, said Mr. Twit. It's the worst in the world. How long have I got it? How long have I got? Cried Mrs. Twit. How long before I finish up with a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes? Well, Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. Well, isn't there anything we can do? Cried Mrs. Twit. Well, there's only one cure for the shrinks, said Mr. Twit. Well, tell me, she cried. Tell me quickly. Well, we'll have to hurry, said Mr. Twit. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs. Twit. Well, you won't last long unless you do, said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. Well, what must it be that I do? Cried Mrs. Twit, crouching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr. Twit. He is one bad dude. Well, next page. Mrs. Twitch gets a stretching. What do you think they're going to do? I know because I'm looking at the page here and I can see what's going on, so I'll read it to you. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and a lot of string. He had a gas cylinder filled for filling balloons. He'd filled an iron ring, fixed an iron ring to the ground. I can figure out what he's going to do here, right? Stand there, he said, pointing to the iron ring, and then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. And when that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, he pulled it up onto the string and trying to go up and up. I'm not reading this so well. Let me try again. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, he put it on its string, trying to go up and up. Mrs. Twit tied to the ends of the string on the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied to her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, and some even into her hair. There were like 50 brightly colored balloons floating above the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. "Well, I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." Oh, and he put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. Her feet, can you imagine this happening to you? Was tied to the ground and her arms pulled outwards by the balloon. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights just to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her bag, her big mouth, and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. "There's enough here to pull me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" explained Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything to happen like that. "Oh dear, no, not at all." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Here, put some more string on my ankles quickly. I feel, I want to feel, totally safe." "Oh, you're very right, my angel," said Mr. Twit with a ghoulish grin on his lips. He knelt down at her feet. He took a knife out from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings, holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up into the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit looked up from below. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvelous bit of luck for me. The old hag is lost, gone forever." Well, yep. Marriage counseling is not going to do these two any good, I can tell you that. Alrighty then, that's the end of that bit.